All right, folks, so we are back in the shop today and we're gonna do another bow building video. Today we're gonna go through my entire tool set for building self bows. I'm gonna go through each tool individually and I'm gonna show you examples of how I use this. Now, I first wanna say that when you're first getting into bow building, you do not need everything that I'm going to show you today. You can build bows with a very, very simple toolkit, and I'll show you some of the very basic tools that you need. But then as you progress and as you get better in your bow making and start trying to build different styles of bows, some of this other stuff that I'm going to show you will really come in handy. It'll make the bow building process go a little bit faster. It'll make things a little bit easier. So with that, let's just jump right on in. So I'm gonna start with some of the things that I feel like for the style of bow building that I do and the way that I build bows, some of the things that I feel are pretty much critical. And the biggest one is my draw knife. All of the draw knives that I have are old vintage knives. They're all old Greenlee knives. So the best advice I can give you for finding a good quality draw knife is just to get on eBay and look for those old vintage knives. This one has got a pretty substantial blade on it. Let's see what the thickness on this thing is. This one's about 6 millimeters thick, so it's very robust. You know, when you're putting pressure on this thing, ripping through sapwood, like if you're working on an Osage bow or something like that, you're not going to bend it like you could some of the cheaper knives. You can expect to pay probably, if you're looking for vintage knives on eBay, probably somewhere around, you know, 50 to 80 bucks for one of these things. But if you get a good one, it's a one-time purchase. You'll buy it and you'll have it for the rest of your life. The second tool that I feel like is pretty much mandatory is some sort of big rasp. Personally, I prefer a Farriers Rasp, which is used for horse hooves. And the brand that I like is made by Heller. And this one is a Black Master Farriers Rasp. I think you can get these for probably about 25 to 30 bucks. But it's got a finer side and then it's got a coarse side here. This thing will really remove some wood pretty doggone quickly. Another rasp here, this is a Nicholson number 49. It's got a flat face on it and then the opposite side is a little bit rounded. I use this a lot for getting in around my fades if you're doing a bow with a stiff handle. Or if you've got a stave with a little bit of character, it's got some dips in the limbs, that rounded side really helps to get down into those things. And then I've also got a big, I don't know what number this is. This is just a really aggressive Nichols File, again with a flat side and a rounded side here. This really hogs off wood quickly. The problem that you can run into this is it's so aggressive that if you really try to put pressure on it, it can be pretty difficult to use. So it takes some learning or some trial and error to get to a point where you can use this effectively. And then the next thing that I feel like is pretty critical is a good set of card scrapers. You can find these on Amazon, and a lot of the stuff, whatever I can, I'll go ahead and just link to down in the video description so you can go down there and you don't have to search for this stuff. But these I use for tillering. Now this gooseneck scraper that I've got right here, these finer edges or these tighter radiuses like this, use those for working around knots and really refining the back on things like Osage. So that right there is your basic toolkit. You could, if you have those three tools, a draw knife, a couple of rasps, and some cabinet scrapers, you can build bows no problem. The rest of this stuff is just gonna make things a lot easier. Another tool that I like to have around the shop is a compass. You can put a pencil or a fine tip Sharpie in this. I believe this one's made by a company called Alvin. But I use this for laying out the bows a lot, for drawing the back profiles on there for anything that has any kind of snake in the grain. I use it for drawing the limb thickness on there, and I'll show you some examples of how I do that. But this thing is a very, very handy piece of equipment. A pair of calipers, and these are metal calipers. They have a little digital readout here. I use these a lot for laying out the bows. I also will use the calipers, and these have a little set here, so I can take this and put it at, let's say, 14 millimeters and set it, and now these jaws are locked, and I can slide this onto my limb and slide them down the limb, and I can tell if I have any thick spots or thin spots in the limb. That's going to help you get your tiller very, very accurate very quickly, so that you're not having to go back and forth to the tillering rack quite as much. I use some sort of straight edge, again, for layout, drawing your tips on there, connecting dots and things like that. I like to have a moisture meter in my bow building kit. Moisture content of wood has a huge impact on the performance of the bows, how much set a bow is going to take, and so keeping track of the moisture content is very important for me. Another place that this is going to come in very handy is if you are backing a bow with, let's say, rawhide or sinew or something like that. You'll be able to use this to tell when those backings are dry enough to move on with the bow building process, start bending on that wood. A tape measure, for obvious reasons. I use this for laying out the bow primarily, finding the center, marking the top and bottom of my riser, mid limbs, where my limb tip tapers are going to end. Just any old tape measure is going to work just fine for that. I use a number 2 pencil or whatever you've got. You saw one in the compass there. So another tool that I use constantly is a heat gun. Now, the type of heat gun that you get is, in my experience, doesn't matter at all. This is a Porter cable. This one was probably 40 or 50 bucks. You could get a cheap $25 Wagner heat gun and it's going to work just as good. This one has a temperature dial on the side. Again, does not matter. Don't worry about that. The way that you adjust the heat that you're applying to the bow is how close you are to the wood and how fast you move this thing. If you have a heat gun, a cheaper heat gun that doesn't have a temperature adjustment on it, just keep it a little bit farther away, move it a little bit faster. And quite honestly, I set this thing to the max and I never use it. All right, so the next tool that I'm going to be using here is a pull saw. This is a Japanese pull saw. It's a thin, curved saw. I use this for cutting the ends off staves, cutting the excess off of nocks. I use it for cutting out my arrow shelves if I'm going to be putting a shelf in a bow. It's very nice for that. I use this for making 2-piece takedown bows. And one of the things that I really like about these pull saws is, number one, it's a thin curved saw, but 2, it's got a very deep blade here. And so if I have to make a very accurate cut, I can look down this blade and make my saw cut and cut a very, very straight line with this thing. This is a much more accurate saw than something like a hacksaw or something like that. So in addition to my little half-round rasp over here, I'll use a hammer and a chisel to cut out my fades. This is a huge time saver when it comes to dishing out those fades and blending your handle down into the working part of your limb. I'll take this thing, stick it on the top of the handle, and just tap down until I work that handle right on down into the fades. For cutting in my nocks, I'll use a hacksaw with a tile saw blade on here. This is basically just a rounded wire with some sort of rough carbide stuff on there. This makes cutting those string grooves into the bows very, very easy. Once I get the initial shape and depth cut out with this, then I'll move on to a 1/8 inch chainsaw file to kind of clean those things up. One thing that is not very common in bow building, but I use quite regularly, is a little wood gouge. And this one's probably about 1/2 inch wide. It's dished out, and I use this to work around knots. Now, one of the places that this comes in very, very handy is if you're working on, let's say you have an Osage stave that has a dip in the back of it. There's no way that you're ever going to be able to chase a ring in across an Osage back that's concave instead of convex with a draw knife. And so that's where this type of thing comes in. You can get this in there and go against the grain and follow that instead of having to use like a gooseneck scraper to scrape through all of that stuff. So I use my my bow square here for some of the final finish stuff, looking at tiller, and then also helping to place that arrow shelf in the right spot. All right, let's talk a minute about clamps. I do a lot of reflex and recurves in my bow, and when I'm doing recurves and reflex, I like these slide clamps. These are DeWalt. I don't think the brand really matters. They're all about the same. But I work by myself a lot, and so these I can use with one hand. They hold pretty well, but they do have some limitations. I use them in conjunction with my form here. So I'll put my bow tip on here, clamp it down, and then I have this in my vise so it's held steady, and then I start bending that bow down using my heat gun. Once I get it laid down here, I'll take the other clamp, stick it on there, and leave it there until it cools. So these clamps are handy, but like I said, they do have limitations. If I have to take and put just a lot of torque on a bow, I'm going to use something like these steel C-clamps. So I use these primarily for aligning staves. So let's say I'm working on a bow that has some alignment issues. Maybe the limb tips aren't lined up with the handle. And so I'll take this bow and use these blocks here that I've made. And you can see these blocks have little grooves cut in them. So I'll stick these blocks up here, stick the bow in here, and these grooves in here keep the limb from twisting. And sometimes you'll need to take little pieces of leather or wood wedges or something to kind of wedge them in here to keep everything tight. And then I take these clamps, and then you can bend those limbs laterally to help line everything up. So I've got my little digital bow scale here, and I've got this one from Three Rivers. Early in the tillering process, I use this for making sure that I don't overshoot by much my target bow weight. So if I'm looking for a 55-pound bow, during the tillering process, you don't want to go much above that if you can help it. A bow building scale is going to help you to do that. And then it's also going to help you to reach that target weight at whatever draw length you're shooting for. Sandpaper and steel wool for obvious reasons. I have an assortment. I've got a whole shelf full of sandpaper up here, and then different grades of steel wool. Just one quick note on the sandpaper. I like this Cubitron stuff. It's I don't know what the material actually is, but good quality sandpaper. It's more expensive, but it seems to cut better, and it certainly lasts a lot longer. So you are paying a little bit more for it up front, but it's going to pay for itself in the long run. So I've got a little tillering string here. This is something that I made out of paracord, and you can just take an old leather glove or something like that and cut the fingers off of it and make something like this. This is not difficult to make. You just need to make sure that don't rely on the leather glove fingers to hold your bow. It's not going to do it. You're going to break something. Make sure that if you make something like this, make sure that the paracord goes through the glove tip and the actual paracord goes over the bow tip, not just the leather. That's very important. All right, so last thing I'm going to talk about here is I've got a couple of calls or forms. This one's for backset, and this one is for reflex and recurve. We'll go ahead and talk about this and get this out of the way. So I do have a video on how I made this, and I get questions about this all the time. How do you make your recurve forms and your backset forms and all that stuff? Guys, it is not complicated, and this is the primary reason that I haven't spent a lot of time talking about it. The only thing that I do is, like, this is a couple of pieces of oak plywood again. This is two 5/8 pieces of oak plywood laminated together, and then all I did was take a couple of things of differing diameters. So this radius right here, this is from a 9-inch circle. This one right here is from a 14-inch circle. And this one I don't have written on there. I don't know what that is. But all I did was look around the shop here, and I found a couple of things of varying diameters, and I just put it on there, traced it out, and then took a jigsaw, cut this thing out, and then cut the center out. So now I can take my bow, stick it on here, and put my clamps anywhere around this thing. I use this for all of my recurves and my reflex in any of the bows that I build. This little shorty here, this is my backset jig that I use quite a bit. The reason this is so short is because I use this one for recurves a lot. And so what I put it on there, and the recurve tips actually hang over the end, so I don't have to worry about those when I'm using this thing. Again, this is just a couple of pieces of oak laminated together. And all I did to make this was take like a piece of PVC pipe, put two pegs, run the pipe across it, and bend the pipe up, and then trace this thing. And you can put as much backset in that thing as you want, and that's just gonna come down to personal preference. All right, so one last thing that I use is just an old chop saw blade. And this one is about, I'd say, 10 inches diameter. I use this for drawing out my fades. So where my thicker, deeper handle fades down into the working part of the limb, I just put this on there and scribe this out. Now this, if I recall, this one's gonna come out to be about a 3-inch fade. And so if you want a fade that's a little bit shorter, a little bit steeper, you're just gonna need to find something that's a little bit smaller diameter, say maybe a paint can or something like that. All right, folks, so there you have it, a comprehensive overview of pretty much all the tools that I'll use in a typical day of building self bows. Now, if you've got any questions about any things that I've shown here, please leave them in the comment and I'll try to answer them as best I can. Or if y'all are using different tools, I'd like to hear about that, and then give me an example of how you're using those things. So, with that, we've got more bow building stuff coming up this summer, more traditional archery stuff. So we'll see y'all in the next one.